And now, it's time for the Well-Read Llama with your host, author Erin Mifflin.
Hello, listeners. It is starting to feel like summer here. It's our first day above 90 degrees, and we can feel it here in the Missouri Ozarks. I'm excited to interview our guest today. Christine Hill Suntz is a Canadian author who writes historical romance. Her debut novel, The Lawyer and the Laundress, comes out tomorrow. This book looks so good, and early reviews are glowing. I can't wait to read it. We'll also talk about her hobby farm, her day job, and her suggestions for new or pre-published authors. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to follow me to keep up with my own writing journey. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram at author Erin Mifflin. Now, let's bring in our guest. Well, hello, Christine, and welcome.
Hi, Erin. Thanks so much for having me.
So your debut novel comes out tomorrow. Congratulations. That is so exciting. What can you tell us about The Lawyer and the Laundress?
Well, this is a romance, a historical romance. So the romance is definitely the main story in this book. It's set in colonial Canada, which in the year 1837. And for Canadians, this is a big year because we had a rebellion that year that really ended up, it was quickly squashed and seemed like it was over, but it ended up really influencing the development of our country. So that's kind of the backdrop. We're in Toronto, which is still a very new city at that point. So only a few decades old for European settlement anyway. And no surprises, there's a lawyer and there's a laundress and they're going to get together. So that's, the basic background and premise of the story.
So this is a marriage of convenience story, and I love a good marriage of convenience story. And my own romance with my husband had a lot of marriage of convenience aspects to it, which made me like and understand these stories in a whole different way. So is this one of your favorite tropes too?
Absolutely. Love this trope so much. And I love it, especially in historicals, although I've read it in contemporaries where it does work really well. I just love how it builds in tension right away. And it also forces your characters together. So your listeners who are writers know that's a big difficulty sometimes in romance is figuring out reasonable and logical reasons why these two characters need to be together on page all the time, because that's what we want to read as readers, right? We want to see those two characters interacting and coming into conflict and getting to know each other and growing and falling in love, of course. So it's one of my favorite tropes always, and it just felt so natural in this story because it's the story of second chances for both of them. Both of them we have a widow and a widower who have a lot of hesitations, wouldn't just jump into a second marriage. So there's definitely got to be some good reasons for them to get together. And mainly it's because of our main character, James, his little girl, Evie, who meets Sarah and kind of brings them together initially. So the marriage of convenience is kind of, although it doesn't happen right away in the book, it really is what ends up bringing them together and helping them fall in love.
I like how you pointed out the intentionality of it. I like that too. Another thing I like about it is that there's such a sense of safety that because it's fiction, these characters are going to end up together. Whereas, in more of another trope, you might have breakups that happen or things, like you said, are keeping the characters apart. But here, I just feel like there's such a sense of safety. And that's something that I am personally drawn to with that.
Yeah. And somehow for us as readers, it doesn't ruin the fact that they're going to get together, right?
It's true.
Because we know that we're reading a romance, we all accept that these two characters are going to get together. And we just want to follow them along the journey. So yeah, that's so true about how you kind of get into that marriage of convenience in fiction. Yeah.
Now, I have not read your book yet, but it is the very next one on my to-be-read list, and I'm so excited about it. And I was wondering, with your main character, the lawyer, do you delve much into his cases? Because I'm a law nerd, and I watch several legal YouTube channels, so I'm intrigued to see how much this might play into the story.
Oh, that's a super interesting question. The only specific case I talk about in the book is earlier on, he is involved in a land dispute. And I put that in there to kind of highlight some of the injustices and difficulties that were facing some early settlers in Canada, to kind of highlight the reasons why this rebellion and this political unrest was happening. I really liked I made him a lawyer, and it was really important to me that he was a lawyer because it really informed his personality. So I think that's more what readers will see in the story rather than the discussion of legal cases, sort of the logical thinking, the intelligence in James, the main character, the sort of calm deliberation, that those are sort of trademarks of his character that I think are endearing, not the kind of like, stereotypical sort of lawyer that is sometimes the lawyers are the bad guys, right? But the lawyers are the good guys in this story who are working for justice and fairness and hopefully a new society for Canada.
Okay. I like that. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I looked through some of the early reviews for your book, and they mentioned the faith theme that you've woven throughout the story. Why was it important to you to include a thread of faith?
It sounds like a bit of a cliche, I guess, but this is a story of like second chances. And it was so important to me that my characters had like seen something of the world, really faced hardship and grief, and out of their experiences, they find faith again. And that's what helps them sort of heal. They uncover a deeper empathy for other people, like an openness to sort of understanding where others are coming from and creating sort of compromise and peace. That was a real theme. And I really felt that the strong faith that James has sort of unshakable faith from the beginning, in spite of the trauma he's been through. He hasn't lost that. Sarah loses a lot of the faith she had as a young woman from her experiences and needs to find it again. But they both come to see that bedrock of faith, she comes to see that was there all along, that faith, God never left her. And that was what eventually brings them to a place of healing where they can trust and love again. And I don't think that healing could have happened without the element of faith in both of their lives.
And that is so true, that faith in our lives too is an important element to true healing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So like you mentioned, your book is a historical romance that's set in 1837, and I am looking forward to learning more about this time in Canadian history, which I confess I do not know a lot about. So have you always loved history?
Yes, I think I have always loved history. I don't remember a time when I didn't read books that were set in the past. So even my earliest, the earliest little novels I read when I was a kid, I was always looking for Little House on the Prairie. That was probably one of the first books I read. And then I was always looking for things like that. So it's always fascinated me, interested me. I would always ask my parents questions about our family history, even from a young age. This time period in Canada's past, we, like Canadians, learn about it in school. It's part of our, I would say maybe in like 7th grade, 8th grade, something like that. And as soon as I learned about it, the characters really stuck in my mind. I think because it was an unsuccessful rebellion. There was a rebellion, but it was squashed by the government and the British military that were in Canada at the time. And I always felt for these rebels because they seemed so idealistic. They had really good intentions. They just couldn't follow through. They didn't have the military training to actually make their rebellion a success. There were lots of reasons why it wasn't successful, but that sort of tragedy really stuck with me. So I would say from the time I was 12 or 13, I was always kind of interested in this time period in Canada's past. So I'm hoping I made it come alive and it will interest and intrigue my readers as well.
That sounds so good. My favorite stories are the ones that are based on real history, and especially things that I don't know and that make me want to dig in deeper and do research myself.
Yeah, me too. I just love it when a writer will take me on a journey and I'll learn about some interesting place or, event that happened or, little tidbit of research that I didn't know anything about. It just fascinates me. I don't like that to be the main thing in the story. I still want the romance, of course, but right. I love those kinds of details. Yeah.
Yes. And on your website, you mentioned that you like to try cooking historical recipes. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the memorable ones that you've made?
Oh, I've had some real experiences with this. I love cooking historically. It was kind of part of my research when I was early on thinking about this time period. And there's a book called The Female Immigrant's Guide that was written by an early Canadian settler. The book came out in 1850, so a little bit after my setting. But I kind of worked my way through and tried out as many of the recipes as I could figure out. And I think some of the most memorable are the puddings, which of course my family was thinking was going to look like, Jell-O chocolate pudding, but is actually refers to something that's sort of boiled in usually in cheesecloth, which a lot of people your listeners would be familiar with, like a Christmas pudding. So that's the one I made, the pudding that probably I made the most. So using like suet, which is beef fat, and raisins and citrus peel, and then putting all this batter together in a cheesecloth and then boiling it in water for a couple hours. And then, making my family eat it. And they were like, what is this? This does not look like pudding. I made some with apples and some with rice too. So those were very memorable. I also had some epic fails making cheese. Wow, that is very challenging. So cheese was a big fail for me. I think because I didn't have the right kind of cheese press to get all of the liquid out of it, but that was gross. And I had some big fails making soap, which is not a food product, but was another recipe I tried to make my own lye. It gave me so much respect for for the ancestors who came before us, we think about our great great grandmothers and the kinds of skills they had and the knowledge they had. I just can't believe all of the things they were able to do. It is so interesting. And I think probably when you read the story, you won't see tons of those details come out because they can be kind of boring if I just went into describing how to make something. But I hope that some of those real life experiences I had helped to make the novel really more authentic for readers.
Yes, that is so fun. And I think also, sometimes I think about this when I try different foods. Like, who was the first person who invented this thing? Who was the first person who made scrambled eggs? Who looked at a bird's eggs and thought, I think I'll cook that, And there's so many different things.
I do the same thing, yeah.
There's so many things I'll be eating sometimes. I'll be like, how did someone ever think of this? This is really bizarre if you just sit down and think about how this first came about.
I think about that all the time. I think about all the plants that you can eat and the ones you definitely cannot eat and think, wow, is this just trial and error? Oh, yeah.
So you live on a hobby farm with goats. So tell us about your farm. Do you have any other animals or do you have any kind of gardens?
We do. We have other animals and gardens. So about 12 years ago, my husband and I left the city. We used to live in Toronto and we moved to the country, and we had an idea, we were going to start a farm, and it wasn't going to be a major source of income, but we were going to try to be as self-sufficient as possible. And that idea really appealed to us. And so we really went in 100% at the beginning. We had pigs, we had cows, we had geese, turkeys. And slowly, little by little, we realized we had bitten off probably more than we could chew, although we survived and had lots of great experiences. But it was a lot, with young children and full-time jobs. I wasn't working at the time. I was home with my youngest for a few years, so that was great. But we slowly kind of focused on the animals that we can manage now that we both are working full-time and keeping busy, keep running our children here and there. So goats and chickens are the easiest for us. So that's what we've kind of kept up. And we do have a vegetable garden, but it is fairly modest. So we don't try to grow everything. We grow, the things that are easier to grow, like tomatoes and beans. I love to have those fresh out of the garden, but the other things I get at the farmer's market now. But it's a lot of fun. And especially when our kids were younger, it was great to have that experience with them.
Yeah. So it sounds like you found something that's sustainable for your family where you're at right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
So my mother-in-law also has goats, and she makes goat's milk soap and lotion and all kinds of products. And when my husband and I were engaged and trying to decide on a wedding date, we already knew that summer 2025 was going to be so busy with other events. We knew two couples who were already looking at early summer. And then plus March is the favorite month of the year for both my husband and I. So, we were like, okay, March would be a good date. And my mother-in-law was like, well, March is goat kidding season. And so we kind of had to choose our wedding date based on when goat kidding season was and let her know ahead of time so that she could arrange her goat breeding schedule. And so once we kind of told her, here, we're looking at this date, and she's like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I felt like we were really locked in and we couldn't back out then. That's the date we had to go for. So that's just kind of a funny story that we can pass on through the years.
I can understand that.
Yeah. So this spring at your farm, you welcomed a bunch of baby goats and you shared pictures and videos on Instagram to document the process. So what are your plans for the babies?
Well, most of the baby girls we keep, but the baby boys, listeners, close your ears if you are a vegetarian. But the baby boys do usually go. They are meat goats. That's the kind of goat we have. So most of the boys will end up having a really life on our farm and then one bad day. And then, yeah, they go for food usually. And the girls, we usually keep them, but we usually sell some for breeding, or also people like goats as pets. If you have a small property, like a country property, a goat is a really good option as far as not nearly as much work as a cow. No farm animal, in my experience, has the personality like a goat does. They are so fun to hang out with. We do have a few sheep now. We've had them in the past. They are much more timid, and goats, they love to interact with people, especially the ones that we make sure we spend a little extra time with, and maybe we bottle feed. Sometimes they can't drink from their mom, so we bottle feed them. Those end up becoming pets, and we usually can't say goodbye to those ones.
Yeah.
So they hang around the farm, and we have a lot of fun with them. But our kids know, and we're also very realistic about what we're doing on our farm, and that, part of what we do is to produce sustainably sourced food for people. So yeah, that's what happens to our babies.
Yes. There was a time when I was growing up when our family had meat chickens, so I can kind of relate to that a little bit. You don't really get too attached to the ones that you know are going to end up on the dinner plate eventually.
Exactly. You try to take really good care of them, but you don't spend a lot of time bonding with them, for sure. Yeah.
Now, you also teach high school French, and when I read that on your website, I found myself wondering something, and I do apologize if this is a silly question, but here in the United States, when we teach French, we teach it as a second language. But is that different in Canada, in Ontario, where you are? Are you teaching it as the primary language for your students?
Oh, this is a great question. I don't think it's silly at all, because it really depends on where you live in Canada. So it's not an easy one to answer necessarily. So where I live, English is the predominant language. There are small pockets of francophones. So those are francophones we call people who speak French as their first language, and people who speak English as their first language, we refer to as Anglophones. So I am an Anglophone. I learned French as a second language, and I teach French as a second language. So in Canada, it's required up until ninth grade that students take a French class. And so that at the end of ninth grade, they can choose whether they want to continue with it to the end of high school, or they can choose to take other electives at that point. But, the goal is that every Canadian has a basic understanding of the other official language. We have two official languages, and most students really value French, even if they decide that it's not for them, they don't want to continue. Most Canadians can see the value of being bilingual and learning both languages. For example, most government jobs, you would need to be bilingual. So in many workplaces, we'll have Francophone and Anglophone customer service, for example. So it's really a useful skill, and it's a necessary language up until ninth grade. And then, we also have in high school, students can also learn other languages, Spanish, German, but French is by far the most common language taught in school here.
Okay, that's very interesting. So now bringing this back to writing, have you always wanted to be a writer?
I think so. That's a good question. I'm trying to think when I first thought of it, but I would say probably when I was about 10. I was a real avid, that's the year that I think probably fifth grade, the year I really started reading a lot, and it becoming sort of my main hobby. My parents would always be telling me to stop reading, right, and go do other things, go outside and play. And I read probably Little House on the Prairie, and then I read the Anne of Green Gables series. And something about Anne of Green Gables, I think for all of us who love that story, Lucy Maud Montgomery is the woman who wrote it, and her life and experiences it was as much about the author as it was about the book in some ways. And I just became fascinated with her and her books and how she wrote and who she was. And I thought, I want to be like that. And I don't know if we can explain as writers why we want to write, but we just know there's just a fascination with it, with expressing myself in the written word and creating a story that I hope people will read and sort of lose themselves in and become fascinated with. So that's always our hope, right? And I don't know why that happened, but it certainly happened quite young for me. But then I didn't act on it. I mean, years went by. I tried writing a fair bit, like when I was younger and then when I was in high school. But then I thought, well, that's not a job as a writer, so I have to do something practical. And I love to travel in languages, so I decided to become a teacher and really improve my second language skills. And then it wasn't until I had some time when I took a little bit of break from teaching, when I had my kids were young, at night I was like, I really think I can write a book. I had no idea how hard it was going to be, of course, right? I could write that, no problem. I could write this at night after the kids go to bed. And I didn't know anything about writing, of course. So that was a big learning curve too. But yeah, I just decided that I wanted to try. And then once you start, Erin, you're a writer too, right? It's hard to give up.
Yes.
I mean, we just love that creativity, and there's nothing like it. So
yes, I can relate to that very well. And as we mentioned earlier, The Lawyer and the Laundress is your first book to be published. And this is such a great milestone and one that many authors are hopeful of reaching someday. So do you have any words of advice for authors who, like me, might be in the waiting stage for publication?
Oh, I still feel like I have so much to learn that I'm like advice. But one thing I could say is don't give up. I think that's really easy to do. I almost gave up. It almost started to feel sometimes like it was selfish of me to work on this hobby I had, right? That I thought maybe it would never come to anything because rejection is so prevalent and so hard to deal with, right? You sent off your work and you maybe don't hear anything or you just get a no. And I would say to people like, don't give up, keep working, keep trying, maybe take a little break if it's too much, but come back to it if it's what you want. And for me, it always came back to, I have this little saying on my desk, you didn't come this far to only come this far. It's one of those, sort of like cheesy little slogan things that you can get to put on your wall. But it really resonated with me. Wait, I've spent all this time investing in this. Do I really want to give it all up right now? And if the answer is yes, I respect that. Telling myself that and seeing that always made me think, no, I can try another month, right? Sometimes I would say, I'm just going to spend an hour a day working on this. And then, just keep working at it, but don't give up.
I've also heard it said, that it takes one yes. You might have to wait a long time, but it really just takes that one,
Exactly. And a lot of it was luck. I mean, a lot of people, I heard more than once, I would say at least, don't set your story in Canada. Nobody's going to want to buy a book set in Canada. And then it just happened that my agent is Canadian and the publisher that she went to said, we've been thinking about publishing something set in Canada. So like those sometimes, maybe it's not luck, maybe it's design, right? But I had to wait until all of those things lined up for me because there were many rejections along the way saying like when it wasn't the time or place for this story at that time. So it's tough though. It's tough to accept that, right? Those things that are out of our control.
Yep. And then God stepped in and said, hey, it's time now, right?
Right? He created the time and the place and the people, but it was hard to wait. Yeah.
Now, you and I met in person in 2022 at the American Christian Fiction Writers Conference. And I remember chatting with you while we were in line for appointments and congratulating you after you won the Genesis contest. I was so happy to run into you after the gala and just say congratulations. So, do you recommend conferences and contests for aspiring authors?
100%. Erin, I still remember that too. And I just remember I went to that conference. I didn't know anybody. And it was kind of a nerve-wracking thing for me. I'm an introvert, like to go to a conference like that. And that connection I had with you, that was such a highlight, right? Just to have a little conversation with someone. And you were, even though we were sort of up for the same award, you were so encouraging and kind. It just made me feel so happy and so welcome and so glad that I had gone. So I do remember that moment and I appreciated it so much. The Genesis contest and the First Impressions contest were huge for me. Getting that validation, first of all, not winning or not becoming a semifinalist was also important, right? Because it told me I have work to do, right? And I could take the critique that I got from those. I got very good critique from those contests that I entered. The judges who had taken the time to give me feedback, like it was very useful. Sometimes it's hard to read, but in the end, you realize that that's what you needed to do to learn and grow. So that was the first reason why I would recommend entering those contests. And then just getting the validation of being a semifinalist or a finalist, or maybe winning. It was just such a huge confidence boost for me that maybe I could write. It doesn't mean you're going to get published, that's for sure, but it definitely gives you that sense of like, I know something about writing. And it also helps you, as we just said, making connections with people. Instagram is great, social media is great, but it doesn't replace meeting people in real life. And I had to push myself out of my comfort zone for sure. That was a super scary experience for me to go to that conference when I didn't know anybody, but I'm so glad I did.
Oh, I'm glad you did too. And I just want to take a moment to insert here that the American Christian Fiction Writers Conference that is coming up this year, it's only about an hour away from me. And I'm so excited about that, to be able to go so close to home. And so if any of our listeners are aspiring authors and they are interested in meeting other writers and getting good encouragement and learning from the workshops and meeting one-on-one with industry professionals, this would be a great place to go. And you can meet really cool people like me and Christine if you go there. So if you are interested, you can go to acfw.com to find out more. Now, is there a scripture that has been meaningful to you recently?
I would say, just because I'm coming back to this story, The Lawyer and the Laundress, of course, I wrote it actually a long time ago, but coming back to it now that I'm so close to my release date, the scripture that really spoke to me when I was writing that has been coming back to me more and more lately as well, which was Ecclesiastes 3. And I think your listeners will be familiar with this scripture: for everything there is a season. And in particular, the lines that really informed this story, The Lawyer and the Laundress, were: there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, time to mourn and a time to dance. And those lines just really spoke to me, because as a Christian, I think sometimes we think we have to be able to instantly overcome hardship, or we shouldn't feel sad, or we shouldn't have tragedy. And, in my lived experience and in the experiences of the people around me that I love who are believers, this is absolutely not the case. Tragedy befalls everyone or anyone, right? And there's a time to weep and a time to mourn. And that's okay to feel those feelings and to go through that sadness. There's no easy answer for that. There is, however, a deep hope that we have in a future happiness, and in the fact that someday we can know that all of the injustice we see around us will be made right, that we can work towards that now, of course, as well. So that was just a really important scripture to me, and it still is, that acknowledgement of the two sides of life, the sadness and the hope.
That's really good. Now, how can readers connect with you?
The best place to find me is on my website, which is just Christine Hill Suntz, and then my last name is suntz.com. You can sign up for my newsletter there, and that is the best way to hear from me, because we all know on social media, there's some writers and friends that I have on Instagram that I try to search for, actually, because I never see their feed, never comes to the top of mine, right? And I want to know what's going on in their life. So I often say that's the best way to meet me, is website and sign up for my newsletter. And then you'll just get a monthly update from me. It's not too crazy what I send out. And Instagram, I'm mostly active on Instagram on social media. So that's just Christine Hill Suntz, Suntz, on Instagram.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Erin. It was a real joy to talk to you.
Listeners, I do hope you'll go to Christine's website and find out more about her and her books. And before we go, please remember to follow me on Facebook or Instagram at author Erin Mifflin. And I'd also be honored if you would go over to my website and subscribe to my monthly newsletter. I've also been working on posting my love story with my husband on my blog. So if you want to find out how our relationship had aspects of a marriage of convenience story, go to authorerinmifflin.com and click blog. I look forward to bringing you more guest authors soon. Until next time,
join us next week for another episode of The Well-Read Llama with your host, author Erin Mifflin. If you'd like to find out more about author Erin Mifflin, visit her Facebook and Instagram accounts.